So, yeah, I'd go Burger Company. Well, thanks for being back with us today. Appreciate you joining us. And like I said, it's good to be back with you after a day out. And thanks to Michael for covering. Michael, where are we at?
We're at verse 9. So we talked yesterday, Clint, about how we are just jumping right onto the scene. And, that we're ultimately at this place of pushing past John the Baptist, who gets lots of airtime in other books, and Jesus arrives preaching and ready, really, from day one to proclaim this good news.
Yeah, and we do have a little of that narrative in what you would have looked at yesterday, that idea that Jesus is above John. Probably no one does that more than the Gospel of John. But if you look at the baptismal account here, the actual story, it's 3 verses,
right?
Which is much expanded in other texts. So verse 9, in those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. That's a mouthful. I mean, that's entire paragraphs in other Gospels. Jesus came, he went to the Galilee, was baptized by John in the Jordan. And then we do get this very short version of another story. And as he was just coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart, the Spirit descending like a dove on him, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved, and with you I am well pleased." What I think is interesting about the Gospel of Mark, Michael, is that Mark, for whatever reason, never feels particularly compelled to explain things. We don't get the follow-up reports like we do in Matthew. This happened because this prophet said that, or in Luke, and then this happened and this person was thinking that, or maybe even more so in John, and then he knew what they were thinking. Mark just sort of throws the story out there and really kind of leaves what it means for the reader in many ways, and it gives it an interesting character. It can give it an abrupt kind of feel. The transitions happen pretty quickly, but I think it makes it an interesting way. You really kind of stick to the basics with this gospel.
Right. And towards that point, Clint, one thing that we talked about yesterday, especially with the references to Isaiah and sort of that idea of looking backwards at the prophecy and how Jesus fulfills it, Mark is very succinct in that. And I think we have that here in this story as well, this idea of the Spirit descending like a dove. There was both this Old Testament sort of idea that the Spirit of God would come in the last days, and then this idea that we see later in the book of Acts, of course, with the Spirit of God being sent by Jesus. I think there's kind of a narrative simplicity here that is absolutely astonishing, that you can cram so much in so quickly. Jesus is connected to the Old Testament people's hope for what God would do, and yet Mark doesn't get bogged down in that. We're just pushing forward towards Jesus's proclamation and what Jesus is going to reveal about God, because that's what this book is about.
Yeah, and if it is the case, as scholars think that it is, and we talked about that the other day, that Mark is the first gospel written, then keep in mind this story provides the bones of the expanded stories in Matthew, Mark, and even John. Matthew, Luke, and even John. The idea that this is where the story, this simple 3-verse narrative of Jesus' baptism is expanded upon with extra details to provide deeper meaning, to provide more insight, to provide some direction. But Mark himself rarely does that. Mark generally sticks to just the narrative of the story itself. And I think, you can see where other gospels would have taken this and why they might have done it.
A thing I would point out here, Clint, if you look at this closely, this is a text that we're aware of, but it's important. Verse 11, the voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved, and with you I am well pleased." Of course, to anyone who's been Christian for a while, these words are familiar, but Clint, reflect on that idea that the voice says, "You are my Son." We're only at verse 11 in the first chapter of this book, and God has proclaimed without question, without ambiguity, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." And that kind of heavenly pronouncement is significant because it points us to really the fact that Jesus is without any ambiguity from day one on the planet, doing what he came and intended to do. And you need to be careful whenever you interpret the Bible for what isn't there. But notice what isn't here, at least, though we may not know what it means. We have no sense of what that meant to the people who may have been standing on the shores there. The idea that they hear this voice, we don't know what they may have interpreted that as. But that being said, if you look at the rest of this book, how often the disciples are going to misunderstand who Jesus is and misunderstand what he's about. There's just this constant sort of haze and confusion. And so while we see so clearly what this voice means, Jesus is being proclaimed Son of God. He's going to proclaim the good news. There is no doubt. But we don't know that that would have been understood the same way for those standing there that day.
Yeah, and I think that's a really intriguing thought in the Gospel of Mark, Michael, because we haven't really seen it yet, but we mentioned in the intro this idea of the Markan secret. So in the Gospel of Mark, people, whether it's demons or individuals, figure out who Jesus is, and Jesus is always kind of telling them to be silent. And so now that makes this very interesting, that in a gospel that has this tension between knowing and telling, knowing and not telling, that we start with the very clear expression that Jesus is the Son of God, that is known by the reader within the very first few verses of the story. And from then on, it's going to be the reader's opportunity to watch characters come to terms with it or not come to terms with that truth. And ultimately, then I'd even suggest that the gospel will ask us what we do with the truth near the way it ends, with the way that it ends near the end. So, a great passage, a lot in there. For only 3 verses, one could unpack that.
Yeah, and then we keep going a couple verses here, Clint. We turn over to verse 12. And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him.
Yeah, so I would point out just in the first couple words here of this verse, this word immediately. If you read Mark carefully, Matthew does this to some extent, but Mark, I think, probably does it more than the other writers. Words like at once, as soon as, immediately, right away. Mark gives these phrases that provide a kind of sense of urgency. Mm-hmm. It also keeps the story moving. And one of the things practically that does is it allows Mark, I think, to be a little sparing with his transitions. You don't really need to work on your transition that much when you say immediately. The Spirit drove him immediately. And so keep an eye out as we go through this gospel for these urgent words, because there are a lot of them, and they give a sense of moving forward quickly in the Gospel of Mark that I think is both intentional and helpful.
Yeah, so this passage here that we're looking at, Clint, is just a few short verses, right? And in Mark, we have this entire temptation described in 2 verses. In Matthew, it's done in 11, and in Luke, it's done in 13. And it just shows you how succinct. I know that maybe we sound like broken records at this point, but that just goes to show how much gets crammed into this short amount of space that's available here. And you go immediately, speaking of that transition, from the Spirit of God descending to the Spirit of God driving. And there's this sort of movement that happens where in Matthew and Luke, you get this image that Jesus is being tested, he's being tried, that has this sense that there's almost some sort of resolution when Jesus, he outlasts and outwits Satan in this encounter. What you have in the book of Mark, instead of that, is this almost beginning of this fight with Satan, that he's tempted by Satan, and Satan's going to show up in many different cases, especially when we get to moments of demonic possession. You have Jesus being spoken to, being addressed. And so there's almost a different sort of punctual set off in the beginning of Mark's gospel here, where Jesus has this short encounter that really begins a story that doesn't end within this temptation scene.
Yeah, and I would say your point is especially made, Michael, given the fact that it's really 3 words: tempted by Satan. That's really the whole of Mark's temptation story. He goes into the wilderness, he's in there 40 days, tempted by Satan. It's just dropped in there.
Right.
It's not expanded. There's no conversation between them. And yet all of the Gospels do this. They connect the idea of Jesus crowning, if you will, this moment of his inauguration at the river with then going out into a difficult period, a hard period of testing in the desert or the wilderness. And Mark adds this, that there were beasts out there. In other words, it was a dangerous place. It was a hard place. And the angels waited on him, so that the spiritual beings are present to Jesus in his struggle and in his suffering. And, you know, what we do with this as text, I guess, would be one thing. But if we were preaching this or trying to expand on it, I think the connection between spiritual moments and spiritual struggles is a powerful one. And the idea that really, as soon as we hear God call us the beloved and is pleased with us, the idea that God claims us, then the next chapter of the story is often the struggle that goes with that, and that there is something in the world, this thing we call evil or Satan in this text, that opposes what God is trying to do, not just in the world, but even in us. Mm-hmm. Tries to keep us from being faithful.
And that's really fortified by that idea of him being in the wilderness for 40 days. Many of us know that that's come up already many times in the scriptures. You have that in the account of Moses. You have that in Elijah's story. 40 is this number that is supposed to connote a long time, a difficult journey, a long and arduous season. And what we find, I think, Clint, is that Jesus, too, has experienced those long, difficult seasons of life. Mm-hmm. And anyone with some years knows that comes to everyone. Everyone will have those seasons. And in many senses, I think this is good news, that Jesus goes from that proclamation, this is my son, my beloved son even. He's about to turn to his earthly ministry in full swing. And yet there's this period in between in which Jesus knows struggle. He knows temptation. He knows what it is to be in danger, these wild beasts. And yet he's tended to by a God who will go with him. I think, not to move into a preaching moment, Clint, but I do think there's a devotional kind of sense in this, a reminder, even in Mark's short language, that Jesus too has experienced the difficulty, even the Son of God who's beloved.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I really think that is a poignant moment for us as we encounter the idea of struggle, because in some ways that sets the foundation for the rest of the telling. Mark, with very little text, has set up this fundamental conflict between Jesus and evil. And Mark is going to show us the way that plays itself out into Jesus' work and ministry and life throughout the rest of the remaining book. And I think we'll see that again. Yeah. In fact, we won't get very far before we'll see it again.
If you want to point to overall themes that we see in this text, I do think, though it's maybe not entirely obvious, there is a sense in which we're already beginning to see that question of who has authority being addressed. And that makes sense if this book is being delivered to Roman Christians in the seat of global power who are being persecuted. The idea that Jesus from the very beginning is proclaimed to be God's beloved son, that God is well pleased, this idea that God has coronated this man to reveal his authority to the world, and that same Jesus has gone through periods of trial and tribulation and struggle, that to people who are making a really counter cultural claim when they say that Jesus is Lord and therefore Caesar is not. Those early Christians may have been able to connect with these words, even at a level that we may not naturally understand.
Yeah, and just one last structural word about this part of the text. I think we see in it the way in which Mark kind of lives at an intersection. The idea that Mark is the earliest we've discussed. Also, along with that is the idea that Mark wrote to primarily Christians who had been Gentiles. In other words, they didn't come from the Jewish faith. They were pagans and then came to Christ. And you can kind of see that here. Mark is not giving the quotations of Old Testament texts. Mark is not, he's not explaining why it matters that John the Baptist may or may not have been a prophet. Jesus is not refuting Satan here. Now, some of that is Mark's storytelling, and yet he's also calling him Jesus, Joshua, Christ, the anointed one, which is very Jewish language. And I think you get an opportunity to kind of see how Mark straddles the fence of the Jewish-Gentile conversation. And there are times I think we can see texts that are clearly written to Gentiles and for that purpose, but other times I think a sensitivity to Jewish as well, the Jewish followers and Jewish people. And it seems to me that Mark does a little both.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the early gospel writers are writing to people on the move in many senses. And the church was in a radically growing and yet challenged situation. It was constantly evolving and changing based upon where the Christians were and what kind of opposition they faced in those different places. And I do think, Clint, that we sometimes see in the other gospel writers a more sustained teacher's voice, especially if you look at a book like Matthew. You get this sense that teaching the reason behind the Jewish laws was in mind. Mm-hmm. You don't so much have that in Mark. It's not really trying to teach Gentiles the background to why these things are these ways. It would rather be more like a Spark Notes kind of version. This you need to know. The Christ is something that is important, but some of these other things the writer leaves for them to go on without.
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say, Michael, that Mark is more interested in Jesus' actions than his ideas. And so, we're going to get almost every healing story is going to be longer than the baptism story, longer than the temptation story. Mark is especially interested in telling people stories of what Jesus did, right, more so than the things about him, that the boxes that needed to be ticked. Where was he born? Did he get baptized? Did he get tempted? Yep. But he doesn't spend much time there, so that I think he can sort of get on to telling the story of, let me tell you about what he did. And for Mark, that seems to have a priority. And we'll see more of it. We'll move into that in the next few days.
Well, friends, that concludes what we were hoping to get through today. I think the only note maybe to make mention of at this point is to say that our schedule's changing. Well, not really our schedule, our format's changing a little bit for the next couple of days. The Gewecke family's throwing a curveball into the mix here, and we are going to celebrate the wedding of one of Rochelle's siblings, which is great and exciting. But Clint and I have both experienced that sitting in front of the camera alone is a little less dynamic, both for us and I think maybe for those joining us, than being in it together. So that said, the next 3 studies, Thursday, Friday, and next Monday, will be pre-recorded and broadcast at this time. So it'll be live in the sense that it'll be playing at that time, but we won't be physically there. It'll be pre-recorded.
Yeah, so if you show up and say, hey, why aren't they starting by saying a bunch of dumb things like they normally do, that's on purpose, and we're going to try and limit the dumb things in the next 3 weeks as we talk primarily about the texts themselves.
3 days.
3 days. What did I say, 3 weeks?
You did say
3
weeks.
Let's go 3 days.
We'll go 3 days. So we'll be back on Tuesday in person, but we're going to be continuing on in the study in the next couple days. So hope you're well, and we will see you all again real soon.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, Welcome! We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.